Imagine this. You're not angry. You're not cruel. You're not even bitter, at least not in any obvious way. You still show up to your life. You still do what's expected. You still say the right things at the right moments. You still help when someone asks. You still try to be decent. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. And yet, something inside you has gone quiet. Not shattered, not screaming, just quieter than it used to be. There was a time when things reached you more easily, when injustice felt personal, when someone else's pain stayed with you longer than it should have, when you cared in a way that didn't need to be explained or justified. You remember that version of yourself. And if you're honest, you miss them. Now you think before you feel. You weigh before you respond. You keep a small but noticeable distance between yourself and the world. Not because you don't care, but because caring feels complicated. And the strange thing is, you never chose this. There was no dramatic breaking point. No single betrayal that hardened you overnight. No moment where you looked at the world and decided to shut down. It happened slowly, through experience, through learning, through adaptation. Almost quietly enough that you didn't notice it happening. So here's the question that sits uncomfortably in the background. How do genuinely good people, people who once meant well, who still mean well, slowly turn cold? Not into villains, not into monsters, just into someone who feels less than they used to. If the answer were simply pain, this would be easy. Pain happens. People recover. End of story. But that's not what this is. What you see, if you look closely, are people who didn't harden after trauma, but after understanding. People who learned how things actually work. People who stopped expecting too much. People who became realistic. People who stopped being surprised. And that's where the confusion begins. Because you didn't lose empathy. You had too much of it for too long, in places that didn't know what to do with it. So you learned to manage it. You noticed patterns. You saw how openness could be used against you. How sincerity wasn't always rewarded. How being the one who cared most often meant being the one who lost the most. And you adjusted. Not dramatically. Responsibly. You pulled back just a little. You guarded certain parts of yourself. You became selective about where you invested emotional energy. At first, it felt like growth. You were calmer now, less reactive, harder to disappoint, harder to hurt. People might have even told you that you'd matured. But something else happened alongside that calm. Your inner world started to feel smaller. Not emptier, just more contained. You began to trade depth for control, warmth for safety, hope for predictability. And you told yourself the same thing almost everyone tells themselves at this stage. I'm just being realistic. But there's a difference between realism and resignation. And somewhere along the way, the line blurred. You stopped asking, "What do I feel?" and started asking, "What's the safest response?" You didn't stop caring. You just stopped letting yourself be affected. And coldness crept in, not as cruelty, but as efficiency. That's the part no one warns you about. Coldness doesn't arrive as something dark or dramatic. It arrives dressed as clarity, as boundaries, as self-respect. It tells you, care less, and life will hurt less. And for a while, that seems true. You suffer less. You're less disappointed.
less shaken by things that used to derail you. But what it doesn't tell you is what it takes in return. Because one day, someone will tell you something painful, and you'll notice that it doesn't really land. You'll give advice that makes sense but feels strangely hollow. You'll listen, nod, respond correctly, and still feel distant.
And instead of alarming you, it will feel normal. That's when coldness becomes dangerous. Not because it makes you bad, but because it convinces you nothing is wrong. To understand this, you have to stop framing it as a moral issue. This isn't about weakness or failure. It's about survival. The human mind adapts, not to what is true, but to what is bearable. Carl Jung talked about this as psychological adaptation. When a sensitive, conscientious person exists for too long in an environment that quietly punishes sensitivity, something has to change. So you build a persona, a version of yourself that can function without friction, that knows when to speak and when to stay silent, that keeps things moving smoothly. You become composed, measured, emotionally contained. And it works. Until you realize that the parts of you that didn't fit into that adaptation didn't disappear. They were pushed underground. Your tenderness, your moral outrage, your idealism, your capacity to feel deeply and respond instinctively. Not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. And when emotions are repeatedly suppressed, not expressed, not processed, just managed, the nervous system learns a simple lesson. Feeling is risky. So it numbs. Not all at once. Not in a way that feels alarming. It numbs in a way that looks like wisdom. Nietzsche warned about this long before modern psychology gave it language. He wasn't afraid of pain. He was afraid of what happens when people trade vitality for safety. When life stops being something you engage with and becomes something you manage. That's when you stop acting from inner truth and start acting from defense. You're no longer asking what matters. You're asking what costs the least. And modern life reinforces this at every level. Be professional. Be efficient. Don't take things personally. Protect your energy. All reasonable advice until it becomes your entire philosophy. Schopenhauer saw the trade clearly. The less you want, the less you suffer. The less you care, the less you're hurt. And that works. But it also thins life. Less pain, yes, but also less meaning, less intimacy, less urgency. Coldness doesn't feel like loss. It feels like relief. And relief is seductive. Because relief tells you you're finally safe. But safe from what? From disappointment, from vulnerability, from being affected by things you can't control. So coldness starts shaping your life in quiet ways. You choose relationships that ask less of you emotionally. You avoid conversations that feel too raw. You prioritize clarity over connection. You tell yourself you're being selective, that your standards are higher now. But ask yourself honestly, are they higher or just less risky? Years later, you may look around and realize your life is stable, functional, well managed, and strangely empty. Zoom out, and you'll see this isn't just personal. A world full of emotionally withdrawn people doesn't collapse. It stabilizes. Rules replace values. Systems replace conscience. Silence replaces courage. No one is actively cruel. But no one intervenes either. The brain adapts to this too. What you don't use, you lose. What you repeatedly suppress, you stop feeling. Empathy dulls. Indifference feels normal. Culture encourages it. Don't get attached. Stay unbothered. Focus on yourself. Useful advice, taken to an extreme. Connection becomes optional. Depth becomes inefficient. Nothing breaks, everything thins, until loneliness is everywhere, and no one can quite explain why. Coldness compounds. Each avoided truth makes the next one easier to avoid. Each emotional exit rewires your sense of agency, until distance becomes automatic. And then one day, you realize something unsettling. You're no longer choosing to pull away. Pulling away is choosing for you. So what breaks the cycle? Not becoming softer, not forcing yourself to feel more. The shift begins when you stop mistaking coldness for strength, when you recognize it for what it really is, a survival strategy that once protected you, but is no longer serving you. You don't need to obey your emotions. You just need to stop anesthetizing them. Emotions are not commands, they're information. Anger tells you a boundary was crossed. Sadness tells you something mattered. Discomfort tells you something is misaligned. Coldness throws that information away in exchange for control. Awareness is choosing to receive the signal without immediately suppressing it or acting on it. That's the difference between numbness and maturity. You begin to take small risks again. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but intentionally. You stay present a moment longer than comfort allows. You say one thing you've been managing. You let yourself care in a place where you usually withdraw. These aren't dramatic acts. They're quiet interruptions. And that's how habits change. Coldness isn't your personality. It's a pattern. And patterns weaken when they're made conscious. You stop outsourcing your values to the environment. You ask, what actually matters to me, even if it costs comfort? Not loudly, not performatively, quietly, consistently. This is what separates people who harden from people who clarify. Clarified people still feel deeply. They just don't disappear into their feelings. They engage without dissolving. They withdraw without vanishing. And here is the truth beneath everything. You didn't become cold because you stopped caring. You became cold because you cared without guidance, in a world that never taught you how to feel and remain intact. Coldness was the compromise. But compromises shape lives. A life without pain isn't meaningful. And a life without meaning slowly becomes despair. You don't need to be warmer. You need to be whole. Wholeness isn't softness. It's integration. It's the ability to feel fully without letting fear decide where your heart is allowed to exist. Coldness doesn't protect you from pain. It protects you from being changed. And being changed requires responsibility. Responsibility for what you notice, for what you can no longer ignore, for acting in alignment with truth, not just safety. So ask yourself, where have you mistaken numbness for peace? Where have you called withdrawal growth? Where have you been waiting for permission to care again? No one is coming to give it to you, because the final step isn't emotional, it's existential. You decide consciously that your inner world is not a liability, that your capacity to feel is not a flaw to be managed, but a resource to be directed. That life was never meant to be untouched, but engaged without being erased. Coldness ends the moment you stop abandoning yourself in order to survive. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Sometimes you'll still pull back, but sometimes you'll stay. Not recklessly,
not naively, deliberately. And that's when life starts to feel dangerous again, in the way that gives it meaning.